Welcome, friends. Today I want to share with you some thoughts about the Secret Doctrine as an esoteric text. Most people that study the Secret Doctrine understand that they will find some esoteric and occult teachings in this text. However, not all students realize that the Secret Doctrine itself is an esoteric work. I think that many of the difficulties that students find when approaching the Secret Doctrine lies in the failure to recognize this particular fact. So let us start by looking at the reception that the Secret Doctrine had at the time. In an article written by Blavatsky, she said, "Ever since the publication of the Secret Doctrine, students of Theosophy have complained that the teachings contained in the work do not satisfy them. One complains that my explanations are not complete. Thus, he says, I have read and reread the Secret Doctrine and collated passages, and nothing is more disheartening than to find some of the best explanations on occult points, just as they begin to grow a little lucid, marred by a reference to some exoteric philosophy or religion, which breaks up the train of reasoning and leaves the explanation unfinished." I think most of those who have tried to study the Secret Doctrine in a systematic way can find sympathy for this student, because this is a common experience when reading the Secret Doctrine. Now, as I was saying, the problem is that the Secret Doctrine is not to be taken as a textbook where we can find a clear and neat presentation of the esoteric philosophy. We need to deal with the Secret Doctrine as an esoteric text, that is, as a text that has been written with what we may call the esoteric method of writing. So what do we mean by this? Let us take as an example what Clement of Alexandria wrote in one of his books, De Stromata. He wrote, "Let these notes of ours, as we have often said for the sake of those that consult them carelessly and unskillfully, be of varied character, and as the name itself indicates," the word stromata means miscellaneous or patchwork, so as the name itself indicates, these notes are patched together, passing constantly from one thing to another, and in the series of discussions, hinting at one thing and demonstrating another. You see, let us stop there for a second. So he's saying that these notes are kind of patched together, constantly passing from one thing to the other, hinting at one thing, demonstrating another. That's actually a quite good description of the Secret Doctrine. This is what you find in many passages of the Secret Doctrine. And he's saying that he's doing this purposefully, with full self-awareness. Then he quotes Heraclitus and he says, "For those who seek for gold, dig much earth and find little gold." Like the miners, you have to dig a lot to find just a little gold. But, he says, "Those who are of the truly golden race, in mining for what is allied to them, will find the much in little." Meaning that those who have the spiritual maturity that is necessary when reading a spiritual text will be able to derive much insights from the relatively small hints that are present in an esoteric text. So this is not only a good representation or description of what the secret doctrine is in many passages. But this awareness of writing with this particular method was also apparently in Blavatsky's mind. For example, Bertram Keightley, who was a close associate of Blavatsky, and he actually was one of the people helping her to finish the secret doctrine and organize the text. He said, "An examination of the method pursued by our teacher HPV." So you see, he frames this as a method that HPV pursued. This examination shows that since she is not permitted to give out the complete teaching, nor to make known even a perfect outline of the doctrine on any plane, she omits such parts and mixes up the remainder to a certain extent, like the pieces of a child's puzzle. So Keightley is saying here, she omits certain things that she cannot say, and she mixes up to some extent the remainder of the concepts associated to that particular fact. And he continues, "For were she to state all that she gives out in its correct relation and order, like it's a systematic work, we could readily fill in the gaps ourselves, and men would thus obtain knowledge, and therefore power, on the occult side of nature, before their moral natures were fitted for the trust. Therefore, she conceals the clue by removing the pieces of the puzzle from their proper context, and so obliging us to have recourse to the light of intuition in order to restore them to their proper places in the perfect scheme." So as this quote indicates, one of the reasons why Blavatsky wrote in the way she did is because this is actually an ancient method of esoteric writings to offer esoteric teachings to the general public in a public form as it is in a book, while at the same time protecting those secrets that would be misused by people who don't have the necessary spiritual maturity. So with this method, you can keep the teachings away from the casual reader, but available to those students that are in earnest. Now, there is a second reason that Keightley mentions here, that is, when you have a text that is systematic, that is understandable, that your lower mind can grasp, then it's very easy to stay at the level of the concepts. Because you read, you understand, you think, you got it, move on. But as we are going to see, what the esoteric teachings require is the use of intuition. He says to have recourse to the light of intuition. And the effort necessary to stimulate or to tap into our intuition that comes from our higher nature, that effort is more easily induced in a text that is confusing to the mind than in a text that is perfectly fitted for the lower mind. So for the earnest student, one of the important aims of the method of writing esoterically is that it stimulates our spiritual intuition. And we can see this in the following quote from Mahatma KH. He said, "You will find that it was never the intention of the occultists really to conceal what they had been writing from the earnest determined students. I mean, they did conceal or try to conceal information from the casual student, but not from the earnest and determined student. So what was their aim in writing in this way? The master says, but rather to lock up their information for safety's sake in a secure safe box, the key to which is intuition. And then he says, the degree of diligence and zeal with which the hidden meaning is sought by the student is generally the test how far he is entitled to the possession of the so buried treasure. So here again, the master is talking about a key to unlock the secret meaning that is hinted in esoteric works, and that key is the intuition. And how do we access that key? By the degree of diligence and zeal that with which we seek to discover the hidden meaning in the text. So we see in all these quotes that there is this common thread, the idea of having a student work to be able to dig the gold or the spiritual gems out of the text, and not just intellectually, but by means of his or her own intuition. So when texts are written in this way, is a casual student will come and read it and get frustrated and confused and tired and abandon the book. But the earnest student needs to know that the book is written in that particular way for a purpose. Because otherwise, a student that may be earnest but goes to the secret doctrine expecting that this is a textbook will think that there is something wrong with the text because he or she doesn't find the textbook. It is for this reason it's important to understand that the secret doctrine and its muddled and confused and even chaotic nature is there by design. And for this reason, Blavatsky says, does it not stand to reason that a work which compares several dozens of philosophies and over half a dozen of world religions, a work which has to unveil the roots with the greatest precautions, as it can only hint at the secret blossoms here and there, this work cannot be comprehended at a first reading, not even after several, unless the reader elaborates for himself a system for it. So see here we find similar elements to what we have been pointing to. The fact that Blavatsky had to write with the greatest of precautions, she could only hint the secret blossoms here and there, and therefore the student needs to be able to develop his or her own system to study the secret doctrine, to gather the information, to interpret and understand the esoteric meaning behind the words. So all of this points to what I think is the most important feature of the secret doctrine, and that is that this book is part of what we may call the yoga of wisdom or Jnana Yoga. So the study of the secret doctrine, the proper study of the secret doctrine, is actually a form of yoga. So in the remainder of this presentation, we are going to explore what this means and what should be the attitude when we approach the secret doctrine so that the study can be a form of yoga. So let's start with Blavatsky's statement that if one imagines that one is going to get a satisfactory picture of the constitution of the universe from the secret doctrine, one will get only confusion from its study. This statement and several others in this part of the talk come from some notes that a student, Bowen, took during some classes on the secret doctrine that Blavatsky was conducting toward the end of her life, actually up to a month before she died. There is evidence that these classes existed. There are other students that mentioned these classes at the end of 1890 and the beginning of 1891, and this seems to be the class that Bowen attended. Some people may not trust what Bowen says, but in my personal opinion and experience, everything that these notes say make perfect sense to me, and they sound like this is something that Blavatsky actually said. But anyway, of course, we are free to regard or disregard those quotes. So then she is reported again by Bowen to have said, "Come to the secret doctrine," she says, "without any hope of getting the final truth of existence from it, or with any idea other than seeing how far it may lead towards the truth. See in study a means of exercising and developing the mind, never touched by other studies." So in the previous quote, Blavatsky said, if you come to the secret doctrine to get a clear idea of any particular truth, you are going to be confused. That's what happens with most people who try to study the secret doctrine. So she says, don't come here to have an intellectual or philosophical explanation of, any particular truth. Come to the secret doctrine to see how far it can take you towards the truth. So she says the study is a means to exercise and develop an aspect of the mind that is not touched by other studies. The idea is that, as we are going to see, the truth cannot be captured by words, especially spiritual truths. So what the secret doctrine is trying to help us with is our own perception of truth. And this perception of truth has to be done with what we call the higher mind, not with the lower mind, the conceptual mind that is based on the senses and the information that comes from the senses. Why is it necessary to approach the secret doctrine from the point of view of the higher mind, which is the one that is connected to buddhi or the spiritual intuition? Blavatsky explains it here. In a conversation with students, she said, "Your axioms of logic can be applied to the lower manas, to the lower mind, only, and it is from the perceptions of kama manas alone that you argue." Kama manas is also part of the lower mind, the mind moved by desire and the senses. But, she says, occultism teaches only that which it derives from the cognition of the higher ego or the buddhi manas. You see, occultism is what comes from the cognition, the perception that our higher ego has. In other words, whenever there are esoteric teachings or occult teachings, these are the teachings about how our higher ego perceives the cosmos, not how the personality perceives life, the cosmos, etc. The esoteric teachings are telling us how our higher ego perceives the cosmos, the laws of nature, the process of evolution. Our higher ego has a perception that goes far beyond the senses and what we may call the rational mind. At the level of the higher ego, Blavatsky explains there is a direct perception of universal truths. So occultism is, or the occult teachings are trying to express that kind of perception. Therefore, it is no wonder that in order to be able to understand the esoteric teachings, we need to tap into that kind of perception. So here is another quote where Blavatsky is emphasizing this and showing the relativity of words. She says, higher realities cannot be represented by words. I mean, this should be obvious if we think about it. Words, the words we have, are designed to describe things that we perceive with our senses. Therefore, things that belong to the world of matter. Of course, we have some words that are not pointing out to objects, like the word eternity, but actually the word eternity is connected to something that we can perceive, that is the idea of time. So for us, eternity means time that we can perceive, but extended infinitely, for example. So at the level of the lower mind, when we use words, we are dealing with things that can be perceived on the physical plane through the physical senses. Now, if occultism is about what the higher ego perceives on the spiritual planes, it is evident that the words that we have are not going to be appropriate to describe the experience of the higher ego on a completely different plane, where perception is completely different, where the cognition is completely different, not through the kind of thinking that we experience, etc. And this is a problem that we have to face from the very beginning. When we read the Secret Doctrine, we are encountering words. Of course, the Secret Doctrine or any other text for that matter. So there is an intrinsic limitation there. So she continues, the higher realities must be represented by the feeling of intuition. It is with your higher self that you must understand, and not with your brains and intellectual perceptions, which are all sensuous, from the senses, perceptions, and will not help you. So you see, this is a situation. If we want to benefit from the study of the Secret Doctrine, we need to approach that book from our higher consciousness. This again is repeated by Master KH. He says, the recognition of higher phases of man's being on this planet is not to be attained by the mere acquirement of knowledge. Volumes of the most perfectly constructed information cannot reveal to men life in the higher regions. You see, volumes of the most perfectly constructed information cannot reveal what life is and consciousness in the higher regions. One has to get a knowledge of spiritual facts by personal experience and from actual observation, not just by means of thinking about it and acquiring knowledge. Of course, the Master is not saying here that knowledge is not necessary, because one could ask, okay, if that is the case, if words cannot represent truth, if one has to perceive directly on spiritual planes realities, then why bother writing books or teaching verbally? And the answer is that even though knowledge and words are not enough, they are necessary. So the Master says here that the recognition of higher phases cannot be attained merely by acquiring knowledge. But the acquisition of knowledge is the first step. And here is what we need to understand. Many times students think that the aim of their work is to get to know the Secret Doctrine, for example, the information that is there, and be able to repeat it, give talks if necessary, etc. That's not the goal of your study. That is actually the first step of your study. Because, as we are going to see, by using the mind and the information that we get in the right way, we can eventually transcend the mind and come to a direct perception of the higher realities. So for this reason, Blavatsky says, it is worse than useless going to those whom we imagine to be advanced students and asking them to give us an interpretation of the secret doctrine. This is again reported by Bowen. I think she would include herself here, and we will see why. So it is useless to try to get the correct interpretation of the secret doctrine from somebody. Why? Blavatsky says they cannot do it. If they try, all they give are cut and dried exoteric renderings which do not remotely resemble the truth. So again, we are communicating with each other at the level of concepts. So a person may understand the concepts in the secret doctrine, that person may repeat them, but that repetition is not the truth. It's a conceptual expression of spiritual truth that, as we are seeing, they must be perceived from our spiritual nature. From this point of view, it's not just a problem of the secret doctrine. It's a given for any text that is trying to share esoteric teachings. So Blavatsky continues, to accept such interpretation from people means anchoring ourselves to fixed ideas, whereas truth lies beyond any ideas we can formulate or express. So again, truth is beyond the conceptual mind. The perception of truth is different from a conception of truth. An easy example, I can explain what, for example, that the absolute is eternal. So you can learn conceptually what the absolute is, you can learn conceptually what eternal means. So when I tell you the absolute is eternal, you can say, sure, I get it. But what you are getting, or what I'm getting, is the concept of what those words mean, which is very different from the actual perception of or experience of the absolute as eternal. So you see there is a very clear difference. So Blavatsky is telling you here, you don't want to stay at the level of ideas. You want to jump toward the perception of truth. Now, she says, exoteric interpretations, I continue with the quotes, are all very well, and she does not condemn them. So she's not against writing about these teachings. I mean, that's what she did in her whole theosophical career. She does not condemn them so long as they are taken as pointers for beginners and are not accepted by them as anything more. So she was concerned that students would content themselves with the understanding of ideas instead of using those ideas to perceive the truth. So the ideas are not the goal, the ideas are the means for a further goal, that is the perception, a perception that comes when we transcend ideas. And for this reason, she wrote, spiritual occultism forbids the use of figures or even symbols further than as temporary aids. So here again, sure, that can be your first step. Use figures, symbols, words, diagrams. That can be your first step. But it's only your first step. She continues, once define an idea in words, and it loses its reality. Once figure a metaphysical idea, and you materialize its spirit. Figures must be used only as ladders to scale the battlements, ladders to be disregarded once the foot is set upon the rampart. So you see what she's proposing here is that when you give a metaphysical idea, or rather I would say a metaphysical reality that is being hinted at by means of an idea. when you take that idea that you read from a book, and you give it a form, you give it an image, then you are materializing it, because you are coming down to the realm of concepts. So she says, all these words, figures, symbols, diagrams, they can be used as a ladder that has to be disregarded once that particular ladder, or each one of the steps, has helped you raise your consciousness. So when you are climbing a ladder, there is one step that can be, each of the steps individually is fundamental in your process of climbing. But if you get stuck in any single step, then you are not going to climb all the way up. So similarly with ideas, there is a way to work with ideas so that each idea is important as a temporary step, but its importance ceases if you get stuck in that idea. So then she continues, let the esotericists, therefore, be very careful to spiritualize the instructions and avoid materializing them. Let them always try to find the highest meaning possible, confident that in proportion as they approach the material and the visible in their speculations on the instructions, so far are they from the right understanding of those instructions. So here is the method, the key to the attitude that is necessary to use these ideas as a ladder. So she says, realize that the more you bring those ideas into the realm of your personality, of your understanding, of the physical world, the further you are from the spiritual reality of that idea. So therefore, she says, try to spiritualize the teachings, to try the highest possible meaning rather than the opposite. So for example, if we are talking about let's say the unity, and that we all come from the same source. In your study, you may imagine this source as being the source of a single substance of which we are all made, and we are all made of the same substance, therefore essentially we are the same. And sure, that's an aspect of the unity, and that's easy to visualize. But that's the lowest and most material aspect of unity. And in fact, scientists know that. They know that all the diversity of atoms and subatomic particles that exist, they all come from a single, let's say, quantum field that is the same field behind everything and everybody. But that knowledge doesn't make the average scientist more spiritual, because it is a material interpretation. So the student, you can always start with what is closer to you. We tend to do this in our study. You have an idea, and in order to grasp that idea first, you materialize it. You bring it down to your level. You try to see it, what example of this could be in our daily life or in the world we know. And again, Blavatsky does not condemn that, as long as you take it as your first step and then you start working to spiritualize that idea. So in this case, don't stay at the level of understanding the one source from a material point of view. Begin to ponder over and to do a meditative inquiry into what does unity mean at the level of emotion, our emotional field. What does it mean that we are one emotionally? What does it mean that we are one at the level of the mind? What does it mean that we are one at the level of consciousness? We feel ourselves to be individuals. What does it mean that we are not individuals, that we are one? And understanding that oneness, what's the place of the individual? How does the individual fit in something that is really a unity. You see, you are when you study in the secret doctrine, start at the level that you can grasp, but then inquire, trying to spiritualize the teaching, trying to find the highest possible meaning that you can grasp. That's the method that Blavatsky proposes. So she says it must be remembered that all these stanzas, the stanzas of Jian she was talking about, appeal to the inner faculties rather than to the ordinary comprehension of the physical brain. We have seen that. However, the physical brain is the vehicle, while we are operating on the physical plane, for all the different principles of consciousness. So if we are going to access our intuition, our higher mind, and so on, while operating on the physical plane, we need to do it through the physical brain. And the brain is an important obstacle for the perception of truth. The brain itself needs to be reshaped so that it becomes more and more, or a better and better vessel or receptacle of the spiritual intuitions. And this is actually a kind of side effect of the study of the secret doctrine, according to Blavatsky. She says, ordinary intellectual activity, our ordinary thinking, moves on well-beaten paths in the brain and does not compel sudden adjustments and distractions in its substance. But this new kind of mental effort, she's talking about this in the context of the secret doctrine. This is again part of the Bowen notes. This new kind of mental effort calls for something very different: the carving out of new brain paths, the ranking in different order of the little brain lives. You see, she was saying this in the 1890, 1891. Today we know that the brain and the cells in the brain, the neurons, they establish like pathways of communication with the synapses and all of that, and there is a network. Our thinking generates a particular network of neurons that is primed to perceive the world and everything in that particular way. So what Blavatsky is saying here is that the study of the secret doctrine, when we approach it in this way, trying to find the highest meaning and so on, will rearrange the brain so that the brain itself generates a new kind of network that is primed to receiving the spiritual intuition. Now, because we are actually changing the structure of the brain, she says, if forced injudiciously, it may do serious physical harm to the brain. So we have to be measured in our efforts. There is the idea that pain is always a danger signal. So you can be very earnest and you may have a lot of will, but you have to be careful not to push too much the structure, the living organism that is the brain, because you can harm it. So whenever you feel that the brain gets either your head hurts a little or you start feeling like a pressure, then that's the signal to relax the effort, let the brain rest, and then you come back to the study. Now, she continues, the true student of the secret doctrine is a Jnana yogi. And this path of yoga, Jnana Yoga, is the true path of the Western student. It is to provide him with signposts on that path that the secret doctrine has been written. So here Blavatsky clearly states that the study of the secret doctrine is a form of yoga and was written not to give you the truth, to give you signposts in your search for the perception of spiritual truths. So let us look into the kind of thinking or the kind of study that the process in which we need to engage so that the study of the secret doctrine is a form of yoga. Again, Bowen reports Blavatsky saying, "This mode of thinking," she says, "is what the Indians call Jnana Yoga. As one progresses in Jnana Yoga, one finds conceptions arising which, though one is conscious of them, one cannot express nor yet formulate into any sort of mental picture." So that's the first stage. You start having the sense of what Blavatsky is talking about, in connection to any particular subject, but you cannot quite put it into words. You cannot generate a mental picture. That's the first stage, but the conception is beginning to develop. Then the quote continues, "As time goes on, these conceptions will form into mental pictures." And here is where you start developing a clear idea. Now, Blavatsky says this is a time to be on guard and refuse to be deluded with the idea that this newfound and wonderful picture must represent reality. It does not. Remember, we said ideas are not the reality. They may be a reflection of the reality, they are not the reality. And she continues, "As one works on, one finds the once admired picture growing dull and unsatisfying, and finally fading out or being thrown away." So, if you continue to study, at some point you start realizing that that idea that was satisfactory at the beginning is limited. You start to see the cracks in it, and you realize that this idea, with your more sophisticated and nuanced and deeper understanding now, that those ideas don't quite fit. So then you discard it. But this, she says, is another danger point, because for the moment one is left in a void without any conception to support one, and one may be tempted to revive the cast off picture for want of a better picture to cling to. So if you think that the aim of the study is to have a clear idea, then that idea will become a prison. When even if you see that the idea is not quite appropriate, it will be difficult to let it go and now stay in that. It feels like going back to the beginning, where you say, okay, I don't have a clear idea of this because that one is not appropriate. So if you are focused on getting ideas, it's very easy to say, well, it's not that bad, let me just ignore this and this idea is fine, is good enough. So Blavatsky says this is a danger if you are approaching the secret doctrine as a way to lead your consciousness towards the truth. So Blavatsky says the true student will, however, work on unconcerned, even if you lost that idea, and presently further formless gleams come, which again in time give rise to a larger and more beautiful picture than the last. But the learner will now know that no picture will ever represent the truth. This last splendid picture will also grow dull and fade like the others. And so the process goes on until at last the mind and its pictures are transcended, and the learner enters and dwells in the world of no form, but of which all forms are narrowed reflections. So you see, it's this process in which, by trying to grasp the highest possible meaning in the teachings, you generate the best picture that you can, but then the continued effort will allow you to generate a higher, more spiritualized conception, and then again you generate more and more spiritual conceptions, less and less concrete, until that process allows your consciousness to go beyond ideas and go into the spiritual level of perception. So this is the process. Now the last thing that I wanted to share are some tips that I have found helpful in my own study of the secret doctrine. I share them in case they are helpful to you. in their entirety or some of these aspects. I have written about this in my book Approaching the Secret Doctrine in chapter 7 for those who may have it. Here I am going to list it briefly, but to give you an idea of one approach to this kind of study. So the first point that I find helpful is to demarcate the field of study. That is, don't go to the Secret Doctrine to read one page after the other. Maybe you can give a general reading and then focus on one fragment. It can be one paragraph, a couple of pages, the commentary to one shloka, whatever, one fragment that you feel has some esoteric information that you want to work on. And you say, okay, I will work on this and not move on until I have done the best that I can with this. Then, as you study, pay attention to the context, because Blavatsky, the way in which she presents the teachings is very, let's call it relativistic, in the sense that she says, for example, she gives an example, from the point of view of the Absolute, the first logos is manifested, is light, and the Absolute is darkness. So sometimes she will talk about the first logos as light, etc. But then she says, from the point of view of the third logos, which is the manifested, the first logos is unmanifested and is darkness. So you may find that in some places she talks about the first logos as the ray of light coming from the Absolute, and in other places as the hidden and manifested Father. So always pay attention to the context to see that gives you the key as to how to interpret what you are reading. Then read carefully. Try to understand every word, every sentence. If there are words you don't understand, go to the dictionary. Read carefully. This is not a race. This is not about finishing the book as soon as possible. Read everything carefully and try to identify the main ideas. Because as Blavatsky said, she will get off of a tangent and bring in different traditions, and then the main idea may get obscured. So read a passage several times and try to draw what's the main idea that Blavatsky is pointing to. And also try to separate the exoteric from the esoteric. Because again, sometimes she brings in what other traditions say about the subject, either to illustrate what she says, to support what she says, or sometimes she's just showing how this subject was seen in different ways. So you can't assume that everything that Blavatsky writes there is what the esoteric philosophy says. So with a little, keeping this in mind, with a little experience, you will be able to separate the esoteric from the exoteric. And then keep in mind the 4 basic ideas. I don't have time to talk about this here. I have explained them at length in the book Approaching the Secret Doctrine, or otherwise you can go and read about them in the Bowen notes. But it is important to study the Secret Doctrine from the point of view of the 4 basic ideas. And all of this, which is the intellectual kind of work that we need to do, has to be at the service of a meditative study. So when you meditate, when you study, do it as you do when you meditate. Sit there, be ready to ponder over things, to stay in silence, to be open to insights from within, to engage with the text again, to try to seek for the highest possible meaning, and to be in silence again. You see, a meditative study, so that you can give the opportunity to the perception from the higher nature to come and illumine the work that you are doing. And as we proceed in this way, we ascend in the different states of mental consciousness, and eventually we can break through to our higher consciousness, where we can perceive those things that seem concept to the lower mind as realities. Thank you.